Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep today into the ultimate financial watchdog of the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC.
Right.
And this is an agency whose creation story is, it's completely tied to the biggest catastrophe in American financial history.
It absolutely is. Yet its current battles involve regulating things like decentralized digital tokens and measuring the financial risk of climate change. It's a huge span.
What's so fascinating here and what we really want to get into is that the foundation of the SEC, which was born from just sheer economic panic.
Total collapse of trust.
Exactly. That foundation defines everything it does today. For you, the listener, we're going to be analyzing how this agency, set up back in 1934, is really struggling to regulate 21st century finance.
And why that fight is becoming more and more complex.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to give you a deep but hopefully quickly understandable look at the history, the kind of Byzantine structure, and the evolving role of the SEC.
We're going to cover its core mandates, its organizational complexity, some of its biggest wins,
And some of its most embarrassing operational failures. All of this is designed to give you a shortcut to being really well-informed about the organization that safeguards, or, PRISM's fails to safeguard your investments.
Let's get into it.
Let's set the stage. The SEC wasn't created because regulators just woke up one morning and decided to, optimize the capital markets.
Not at all.
It was formed specifically on June 6, 1934, as a direct, non-negotiable response to the spectacular abuses that plunged the country into the Wall Street crash of 1929.
And the Great Depression that followed. That historical context is everything. Before the crash, the markets operated largely on speculation and, well, privileged information.
A real free-for-all.
It was. The lack of reliable, standardized information, plus rampant insider trading and just outright market manipulation, meant that when the financial system fractured, there was zero trust left.
So the SEC's initial, and really its primary purpose, was to enforce laws against that manipulation.
Right, and in doing so, to rebuild public faith in capitalism itself. It was that fundamental.
And that restorative purpose leads us directly to the agency's foundational three-part mission. It's concise, but it's an incredibly broad statement of purpose.
And these three parts are often in tension with each other, which is key.
Okay, so first, they're there to protect investors.
Number one.
Second, they have to maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets.
And third, they must facilitate capital formation.
And that tension you mentioned is really the key to understand the SEC's operational difficulties, isn't it?
It's absolutely key. Protecting investors usually means imposing rigorous rules, meticulous disclosure requirements, expensive compliance measures. A lot of red tape.
But those very requirements can sometimes get in the way of that third mission.
Exactly. The speed and efficiency of capital formation, especially for, say, small businesses looking to go public.
Can you give us a concrete example of that trade-off?
Certainly. Think about the regulation that came after the Enron scandal, specifically the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002.
Right, SOX.
While it was universally praised for dramatically improving financial reporting integrity, which, supports investor protection, the costs and complexity of compliance for small cap companies became, well, prohibitive.
That was too much for them.
We saw documented cases where companies chose to remain private or even delist from public exchanges, specifically because the cost of compliance under these new SEC-enforced rules was just too great.
That's a perfect example of how strong investor protection can potentially slow down capital formation.
It's a constant balancing act.
So how does the SEC try to balance this triangle of competing goals?
They rely on a central, really powerful mechanism: mandatory statutory disclosure. This is the lifeblood of the SEC.
The paperwork.
The paperwork. The requirement that public companies and other regulated entities must submit regular standardized reports. This includes the quarterly reports, Form 10Q, and the massive annual reports, Form 10K.
And the power of that disclosure is that it aims to level the playing field, right?
Precisely. This mandatory disclosure is designed to provide both private individuals and the largest institutions with the same fundamental facts about the public companies they invest in.
So everyone gets the same basic info.
Right. And this act of public transparency is what allows markets to be efficient. It increases public scrutiny, makes fraud harder to hide, and ideally, it reduces the kind of unchecked insider trading that flourished before 1934.
And within those vast, often very dry financial filings, there's a required section that is maybe the most revealing window into the executive mind. The management discussion and analysis, the MD&A.
The MD&A is crucial because it goes beyond just the raw numbers. It's a required narrative account from the company's executive.
They have to actually explain themselves.
They do. They have to outline the previous year of operations, explain how specific company performance metrics were achieved, and most importantly, address the upcoming year.
So their strategy.
Their future goals, potential threats, and strategic approaches to new projects. It forces context alongside the quantitative data. It's a qualitative assessment that's intended to help you, the investor, understand the story behind the numbers.
For the modern investor who wants to access these stories and the cold, hard numbers, there's one primary gateway.
That would be EDGAR, the Electronic Data Gathering, Analysis, and Retrieval System.
EDGAR.
It's been the primary online database for registration statements, 10Ks, and all that associated material since, I think, the mid-1990s. If you want to research a public company, EDGAR is your first stop.
And it's important to remember that EDGAR isn't just a passive archive. It's a two-way street for the SEC.
Exactly. While it is the repository for official corporate filings, the same platform accepts tips and complaints from investors and citizens.
So the public can report things.
Yes. And this public-facing function helps the SEC's enforcement division track down potential violators of securities laws. It effectively uses the public as a kind of decentralized layer of oversight.
That's a great way to put it.
The sheer volume of information flowing through EDGAR daily, both corporate disclosures and public complaints, is just staggering. It makes it absolutely essential to the SEC's operations.
So to really understand the political weight of the SEC's founding, we need to examine the regulatory landscape right after the crash. Before federal intervention, what was even governing the trading of securities?
Before the New Deal legislation, securities trading was governed primarily by state-level regulations, which were known colloquially as blue sky laws.
Blue sky laws.
Yeah, the term originated in the early 20th century because investors needed protection from promoters who would sell them shares in speculative schemes that amounted to nothing more than a piece of blue sky.
But the crucial problem wasn't a lack of intent at the state level. It was a lack of jurisdictional power, which made those blue sky laws almost useless.
They were consistently ineffective, precisely because commerce in the U.S. isn't limited by state lines. We have records from as early as 1915 showing the Investment Bankers Association advising its own members on exactly how to circumvent these state laws.
So they were actively teaching people how to get around the rules.
Oh, yes. The loophole was simple but devastating. If a broker made offerings across state lines using the mail system, they could often bypass state-specific regulatory provisions entirely.
I see.
So fraudsters realized that the national scope of their schemes demanded a national federal regulatory response to stop them from exploiting interstate commerce.
And that response came directly out of the New Deal. It was spurred specifically by the Pecora Commission hearings, which were just instrumental in exposing these spectacular abuses, conflicts of interest, and fraud in the securities markets.
And that leads to the two foundational acts that give the SEC its authority.
Right.
The first, enacted before the SEC even existed, was the Securities Act of 1933. This act federally regulates the original issues of securities.
So IPOs, the initial public offerings.
The primary distributions, exactly. It mandates that issuing companies register these distributions before they sell them so that investors have basic, reliable financial information up front.
And for the first year, it wasn't even the SEC enforcing this.
That's an important point. For that first year, before the SEC was formed, enforcement of this foundational law rested with the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC.
And the second act is the one that actually created the agency we're talking about today.
That's the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. This law regulates the secondary markets.
The stock exchanges themselves.
The exchanges, the trading between individuals after the initial sale. It governs institutions like the New York Stock Exchange, broker-dealer firms, all the exchanges. Section 4 of this 1934 Act formally established the SEC, transferred the enforcement authority for both the 33 and 34 Acts away from the FTC, and gave the new commission its wide-ranging powers.
Now, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt needed a chairman for this powerful new body, his choice was, well, it was fascinating, Joseph B. Kennedy Sr., a controversial figure.
A very controversial figure. Kennedy was a successful financier, a man of immense wealth, and importantly, he was an insider with deep experience on Wall Street. Roosevelt chose him precisely because of that experience.
So set a thief to catch a thief? Sort of.
That was the logic. He was a wealthy, successful capitalist who understood the abuses from the inside, which gave him immediate credibility with the business community, despite his reputation.
And Kennedy's mandate was incredibly ambitious. His team, which, I mean, it included brilliant minds like James M. Landis, Ferdinand Pecora, and these intelligent young lawyers who would later become Supreme Court justices.
William O. Douglas and Abe Fortas, a powerhouse team.
Right, and they defined 4 core missions right out of the gate.
They were tasked with nothing less than restoring faith in the entire financial infrastructure. First, they had to restore investor confidence, which had just utterly collapsed.
Go on.
Second, they had to prosecute and eliminate fraudulent practices targeting investors to bring integrity back. Third, they aimed to specifically end million-dollar insider trading by top officials of major corporations.
Signaling that the rules now applied to everyone.
Yes. And finally, they were tasked with the massive job of establishing a complex and universal system of registration for all securities sold in the country, with clear deadlines and guidelines.
And the success of that initial team is really part of the SEC's foundational legacy. I mean, by the time Kennedy left, the general public actually felt comfortable returning to the market.
It was a massive psychological victory. They believed they would no longer be deceived.
We should also focus on the early bureaucratic architects, like David Saperstein.
Yes. He was a former associate counsel to the Pecora Commission and helped draft the 1934 Act itself. He became the first director of the Division of Trading and Exchange, which oversaw the day-to-day mechanics of the market.
So what was his immediate, lasting impact?
Saperstein was critical in establishing the detailed bureaucracy that was necessary to translate the law into reality. He was responsible for overseeing the mandatory registration of brokers and dealers and creating the first federal rules for the over-the-counter markets.
So the nitty-gritty.
The nitty-gritty. Crucially, he issued early policy interpretations that shaped market structure, like the 1937 Saperstein interpretation. He was the one taking the grand legal vision from Congress and turning it into enforceable daily regulatory reality. He set precedents that still influence how conflicts of interest are handled by firms today.
Okay, so moving from the founders to the current operational reality, we need to understand the nuts and bolts of the SEC, the architecture that lets it operate today. It's run not by a single director, but by a commission of 5 appointed members.
And that structure is the absolute bedrock of its political independence. The commission has 5 commissioners appointed by the president. Their terms are 5 years, but they're deliberately staggered.
Staggered, how so?
So that a commissioner's term ends on June 5th of each year. This staggering prevents a single administration from just stacking the commission quickly. A commissioner can also serve up to 18 additional months past their term expiration if a replacement hasn't been confirmed yet.
And the political checks built into this structure are vital for maintaining that nonpartisan credibility.
They are. This is a crucial, specific stipulation in the law. No more than 3 of the 5 commissioners may belong to the same political party.
Ah, so it has to be bipartisan.
It ensures a mandatory bipartisan balance, preventing the SEC from becoming a purely political instrument of the executive branch.
And maybe the most potent check on the president's power involves the removal of commissioners.
Yes. The president designates one of the 5 commissioners to be the chair, which gives them specific administrative and leadership authority, but, and this is the key part, the president cannot fire appointed commissioners.
Cannot fire them.
This provision was specifically put in place to ensure the independence of the SEC from direct political pressures. It's the mechanism that allows the commission to pursue politically sensitive investigations without fear of immediate administrative retaliation.
So if the commissioners handled the political oversight and rulemaking, then the 6 core divisions headquartered in Washington, D.C. are the engine room. They handled the daily flow of enforcement and market oversight. Let's walk through their highly specialized roles, starting with the group that processes the paper, or I guess in modern terms, the digital filings.
That would be the Division of Corporation Finance. They are the disclosure gatekeepers. Their primary mandate is overseeing the compliance of public company disclosures, managing the registration of major transactions like mergers and acquisitions, and operating the EDGAR system.
So they're the first line of defense, reading everything.
They are the initial reviewers, the ones who pore over the 10Ks and 10Qs to make sure the documents meet the stringent statutory requirements.
Next up is trading and markets. This is the division keeping an eye on the actual arena where securities are bought and sold.
Right. This division oversees the exchanges and the SROs, the self-regulatory organizations.
Like FINRA?
Exactly. FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and the MSRB, the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. They also monitor all broker-dealer firms and investment houses.
And they delegate a lot of this work, don't they?
Here's a crucial point about efficiency and delegation. The SEC delegates most of its day-to-day enforcement and detailed rulemaking authority concerning brokers and dealers to FINRA. Essentially, if you're a trading firm not regulated by other bodies, you have to register as a member of FINRA, which then acts as the frontline regulator under the ultimate oversight of the SEC.
Okay, then we shift to the institutional investors with investment management.
This division handles entities like registered investment companies, think mutual funds, which are massive players in the market, and registered investment advisors.
So the big money managers.
The big money. These entities are subject to comprehensive regulation under various federal securities laws. Investment management administers two key pieces of legislation: the Investment Company Act of 1940 and the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. Their work is deep in legal interpretation, assisting the Commission in understanding these specific laws and reviewing the specialized filings made by these companies and advisors.
The fourth division is the one that brings the muscle: enforcement. They're the investigative arm.
Their job is to investigate potential violations of securities laws and regulations and bring legal actions against the alleged violators. They have two main routes. They can file a civil action in a U.S. district court seeking monetary penalties and injunctions, or they can pursue an administrative proceeding heard by an independent administrative law judge. But it's vital to reiterate their limitation. They have no criminal authority.
So they can't put anyone in jail.
No. If they uncover criminal activity, they refer the case to federal or state prosecutors. And it's worth noting, reflecting the need for greater regulatory intensity post-2008, their overall resources and staffing were increased by more than 50% following the financial crisis.
The fifth division, the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, DRA, is where the SEC tries to get proactive instead of reactive. It's the new engine of insight.
DRA was formally created in September 2009. They are absolutely the agency's think tank. Their core mission is to integrate sophisticated financial economics and rigorous data analytics into every single facet of the SEC's work.
Policymaking, rulemaking, enforcement.
All of it. Enforcement targeting, examination preparation, everything.
How do they use data analytics in a practical sense? It sounds very abstract.
It needs to be tangible. DRA uses customized analytic tools and quantitative approaches to proactively detect market risks. For example, they employ sophisticated text analysis, what's known as natural language processing, or NLP, on the millions of comment letters and risk disclosures filed through EDGAR.
So they're reading it all with AI.
Essentially. They can program these tools to flag common emerging risk terminology across the entire market, say excessive leverage in a specific sector, or unusual liquidity risks in real time. This lets them break through internal information silos and provide agency-wide analysis, helping the enforcement and examinations divisions deploy their scarce resources against risks before they evolve into systemic crises.
So they're basically trying to spot the next big fraud or systemic bubble before it fully materializes, using predictive data modeling.
That is the aspiration. They provide the quantitative basis for the Commission to act proactively, identifying patterns that the human eye might just miss across the complexity of modern global markets.
And finally, we have the Division of Examinations.
Examinations conducts the National Exam Program. Their strategy is risk-focused, aiming to protect investors and ensure market integrity. Their work is primarily preventative and diagnostic.
So they're out in the field.
They visit firms, broker-dealers, mutual funds, investment advisors to assess compliance, and the information they gather on the ground about common compliance failures and emerging risks is then fed back to the commissioners to inform policy and rulemaking decisions.
And just briefly, to complete the picture, there's a support system and a geographical spread.
Crucial support roles include the Office of the Chief Accountant, which provides expertise on accounting standards and works closely with private standard setters like FASB and the PCAOB. They also engage globally with bodies like the International Accounting Standards Board.
And they're not all in D.C.
No. Since the market is nationwide, the SEC maintains 11 regional offices across the U.S., in major hubs like New York, Boston, Chicago, and Atlanta, to ensure localized enforcement and accessible market oversight.
Now that we understand the structure, let's detail the specific, often subtle tools the SEC uses to maintain oversight and manage market expectations beyond just filing basic forms. We should start by circling back to the Management Discussion and Analysis, or MD&A.
The MD&A is the regulatory requirement that injects that human narrative into the cold data. It's often required to be the first place an investor looks, providing that crucial qualitative assessment of what's happening in the company. It forces management to speak directly about their strategy and outlook.
It's the required context that elevates the report from just a legal document to an actual investment guide.
Precisely.
So if the MD&A is the company speaking to the regulator and the investor, the comment letter is the regulator speaking back.
Yes. Comment letters are a primary tool used by the Division of Corporation Finance. When a company submits a public filing, a 10-K, a registration statement, whatever SEC staff review it, if they find the disclosure is incomplete, confusing, or potentially misleading,
They send a letter.
they issue a letter containing an itemized list of requests for additional information or requiring modifications to the submitted filing.
And this back and forth isn't quick, is it? The process itself can raise serious questions about the speed of their response.
It does. The filer has to reply to each item in the comment letter, and the SEC may respond with follow-up comments. Sometimes this correspondence stretches out over many, many months.
But the whole exchange eventually becomes public.
Yes, and that offers invaluable insight into the regulator's concerns about that specific company.
But the effectiveness of this process is debatable, especially when you look at historical failures. I mean, how can a lengthy back-and-forth comment process possibly keep pace with the hyperspeed of modern corporate fraud? The CA Inc. anecdote from 2001 is a stark reminder of this.
The CA Inc. case perfectly illustrates the structural challenge. In October 2001, the SEC wrote a comment letter to the software company detailing 15 items of concern,
15 items.
including 5 specific issues about their highly aggressive revenue recognition practices. That comment letter went to the CEO. 3 years later, in 2004, that very same CEO pleaded guilty to fraud at CA Inc., resulting in massive investor losses.
So the SEC was already looking at the problem.
The existence of that detailed regulatory concern years earlier raises the critical question. If the SEC was already scrutinizing the exact fraudulent accounting practices through the comment letter process, was their response severe enough or fast enough to prevent billions in losses?
And this tool, which is supposed to help public transparency, has itself faced criticism for a lack of transparency.
Absolutely. In June 2004, the SEC announced this new policy promising to publicly post all comment letters quickly to give investors the full benefit of regulatory scrutiny.
But they didn't follow through.
By May 2006, regulatory filings showed that the SEC was failing to uphold this promise. An analysis found 212 companies reported receiving comment letters, but only 21 of those letters were actually posted on the public website.
Wow.
The head of corporation finance at the time acknowledged the delay, citing hurdles in posting the information, which really highlights a significant operational challenge in governmental transparency.
Let's shift gears to a tool that provides guidance rather than mandates. The no action letter. What exactly are these, and why are they so important?
Now, action letter is a staff-issued letter, and it does not carry the weight of the full commission, stating that the staff will not recommend enforcement action against a person or company engaging in a specific detailed activity.
So it's for legal gray areas.
Exactly. This tool is typically used when the legal status or the regulatory interpretation of an activity is ambiguous under the existing rules.
So if a company wants to launch, say, a new type of financial product, they can essentially ask the SEC staff, if we do it exactly like this, will you sue us? And they can get a conditional no.
That's precisely the function. And they are crucial because once they're released, they increase the body of knowledge available to the public. They serve as a kind of regulatory precedent, offering guidance on what is and isn't allowed without having to wait for a formal rule change or a court case.
But there's a big catch, right?
The critical caveat must always be stressed. These are staff interpretations only. They are not binding on the courts. A federal court could absolutely disagree with the staff's reading of the law.
And the use of these letters has actually shaped entire industries historically.
Yes, profoundly. For over 3 decades, from 1975 until the implementation of the Credit Rating Agency Reform Act in 2007, the SEC relied entirely on no-action letters to define the status of the nationally recognized statistical rating organizations.
The credit rating agencies, like Moody's or S&P.
Right. The SEC staff, through these letters, communicated which agencies were deemed reliable enough for other financial firms to use their ratings for certain regulatory capital calculations. It's a classic example of staff interpretation temporarily guiding market function when Congress hadn't provided a clear statutory definition.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the SEC is supposed to be the ultimate watchdog, and yet there have been periods where the agency has been intensely criticized for being too tentative, too fearful, or just too slow to confront wrongdoing on Wall Street.
Yes.
To address the conclusion of our deep dive, we have to look closely at the moments when the watchdog failed to bark.
And the criticism reached a fever pitch with the revelation of the Bernard Madoff scandal. This was a defining, catastrophic failure that shook public confidence not just in the markets, but in the regulator itself.
Even the chairman admitted it.
Former SEC Chairman Christopher Cox recognized the organization's multiple failures in relation to the fraud. He was very blunt about it.
Let's detail the extent of that failure, because it wasn't a one-time miss. It was a systemic ignoring of red flags over years, decades even.
The Madoff failure began early. An investigation was launched as far back as 1992, focusing on a Madoff feeder fund that, according to the SEC's own documents, promised curiously steady returns.
Returns that just defy market logic.
Right. But the SEC staff allowed that investigation to be closed without uncovering the fraud. And in the years that followed, the SEC missed or outright ignored numerous documented red flags and concrete tips.
And the most famous of those tips came from Harry Markopolos, who basically handed them the mathematical proof of the fraud.
Markopolos first complained to the SEC's Boston office in 2000. His argument was elegant and simple. Madoff's reported profits were mathematically impossible to achieve using the investment strategies Madoff claimed to employ.
He said, the numbers don't lie, and these numbers are impossible.
That was essentially it. Yet, despite presenting detailed analysis of the sheer improbability of the returns, the SEC staff repeatedly allowed the investigation to be closed, citing insufficient evidence or inability to verify the claims.
And this failure was complicated by some really disturbing elements of internal conflict of interest.
This is maybe the most damaging aspect of the failure. An internal investigation launched by Chairman Cox revealed that Eric Swanson, an SEC Assistant Director of the Office of Compliance Investigations, had met Madoff's niece, Shinna Madoff,
who worked as the firm's compliance attorney.
Yes, and he met her while conducting an official SEC examination of the firm. That investigation was subsequently closed. After it was closed, Swanson left the SEC and subsequently married Shanna Madoff.
That is a massive conflict of interest.
This discovery immediately cast a shadow of serious conflict of interest over the integrity of the SEC's decision-making process regarding Madoff's firm.
Beyond Madoff, the problem wasn't just individual corruption. It was a systemic failure within the SEC's own internal oversight mechanism, the Inspector General's office.
Right. The Inspector General is the watchdog for the watchdog. Yet, POGO, the Project on Government Oversight, criticized the SEC in 2009 for failing to act on over half of the recommendations made by its own Inspector General.
So they were just ignoring their own internal auditor.
For example, in the 2 years leading up to that report, the SEC took no action on 27 out of 52 recommended reforms, including recommendations to impose disciplinary actions on SEC employees who received improper gifts from financial companies. The agency was just resisting internal reform.
And then the IG himself was found to have compromised his own neutrality.
Absolutely. In 2012, an independent external review of former IGH David Kotz's conduct revealed that he had violated ethics rules. He was found to have overseen critical probes, including the Madoff investigation, involving people he had personal relationships with.
Like who?
Specifically, the report detailed that Kotz was a very good friend with Harry Markopolos, the Madoff whistleblower. Furthermore, he opened an investigation into the massive Stanford financial fraud when he was friends with a female attorney representing the victims of that fraud.
So the very person tasked with rooting out conflict and failure within the SEC was himself compromised in relation to the two biggest frauds of that era.
It's deeply problematic.
This systemic failure of internal accountability is troubling, especially when you compound it with the jaw-dropping allegation of the destruction of investigative documents.
This came to light in 2011, detailed in Rolling Stone by Matt Taibbi, who cited a whistleblower, Darcy Flynn, a longtime SEC employee. Flynn alleged that the agency routinely and improperly destroyed thousands of documents related to preliminary investigations.
What the SEC calls matters under inquiry, or MUIs.
Exactly.
Why is the destruction of these MUIs so significant?
These were not final adjudicated cases. They were the preliminary investigative files. The documents allegedly destroyed concerned major firms involved in the Great Recession, including Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, and SEC Capital.
So the key players of the crisis.
And this practice, dating back to the 1990s, was controversial on two fronts. First, federal law requires that investigative records be kept for 25 years. Second, the implication was grave. The organization tasked with maintaining market integrity was actively erasing its own records of investigation into the very firms that caused the financial collapse.
And the internal reaction to this discovery was equally disturbing.
According to Flynn, top SEC staff allegedly discussed refusing to admit the destruction had even taken place because they feared such an admission would expose them to criminal and civil penalties for potentially destroying government records illegally.
Unbelievable.
The controversy led to serious questioning from Congress and highlighted the lack of internal controls regarding the preservation of essential investigative history.
Finally, we should note that these operational issues extended even to public transparency requests.
That's right. In a 2015 analysis that tracked the performance of 15 federal agencies that received the most Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, requests, the SEC scored a D-.
A D-.
This poor grade, which was a drop from an already low score in 2013, reflected significant challenges in processing public requests for information. It just further highlighted the agency's struggle with governmental transparency during a crucial period of recovery and renewed scrutiny.
Despite those profound internal challenges, the SEC has been forced to adapt rapidly because the financial landscape it regulates today is unrecognizable compared to the one Joseph Kennedy Sr. faced.
It's a different world.
Let's look at their actions right after the credit crunch before we jump into the modern regulatory frontiers.
In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, the SEC did act decisively to stabilize markets. In September 2008, they announced strict new rules prohibiting all forms of naked short selling.
A practice where sellers don't immediately borrow the security before selling it.
Right. It was an emergency measure to reduce extreme volatility. They also successfully negotiated what were then record settlements, approximately $51 billion in all, on behalf of investors who had been sold toxic auction rate securities by 6 different financial institutions.
Okay, now we arrive at one of the biggest, most complex regulatory battlegrounds of the 21st century, cryptocurrency. And this raises that important question. How does an agency founded in 1934, based on Depression-era rules, regulate a decentralized, global digital asset?
They attempt to regulate it by applying existing legal frameworks, which has led directly to massive conflicts. In 2023, the SEC intensified its scrutiny dramatically.
It went after the big players.
They filed 13 charges against major entities like Binance and its founder, Changpeng Zhao, for allegations including operating without proper registration and mishandling customer funds. And at the same time, they charged Coinbase for operating as an unregistered securities exchange, broker, and clearing agency.
And the core of this legal disagreement hinges entirely on defining whether these crypto assets are actually securities in the first place.
That's it. Correct. The SEC relies on a definition established way back in 1946 by the Supreme Court, known as the Howey test.
The Howey test.
The test emerged from a case involving the sale of interests in Florida citrus groves. It defines a security as an investment of money in a common enterprise, with profits to come solely from the efforts of others.
So the SEC says crypto meets this test.
They assert that many crypto assets meet this test because their value often relies on the marketing, managerial, or developmental efforts of a central group of developers or a core team behind the blockchain project.
And the context of citrus groves in 1946 versus decentralized software in 2024 is what highlights the struggle here. Why do critics argue that the Howey test is just inadequate for this new technology?
Critics argue that the decentralized, immutable, and peer-to-peer nature of many crypto assets means that the efforts of others component of the Howey test is either minimal or, non-existent once the project is fully launched and decentralized.
So they're saying there's no central group to rely on.
Exactly. They claim this rigid application of an outdated test creates profound regulatory uncertainty. Research by economists has pointed out that the unpredictable nature of SEC enforcement actions classifying cryptocurrencies as securities without clear, modern guidelines has actually caused prolonged destabilization in crypto markets.
Which, ironically, undermines the SEC's mission to maintain orderly and efficient markets.
Precisely.
However, the agency isn't entirely rejecting the underlying technology. We saw a signal that they're willing to accommodate blockchain in traditional finance.
Yes, we saw a major signal in December 2025 when the SEC provided a no-action letter to the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, or DTCC.
A critical piece of market infrastructure.
Yes, and this authorization allows the DTCC to hold and record tokenized equities and other real-world assets on blockchain networks for a period of 3 years. This shows the agency's willingness to use its regulatory tools to enable blockchain technology, as long as it's implemented within approved, registered, and highly regulated traditional financial infrastructures.
Beyond digital assets, the SEC is rapidly expanding its definition of material risk to include cybersecurity and climate change. They're forcing companies to disclose these non-traditional risks. Let's start with cybersecurity.
In July 2023, the SEC adopted the Cybersecurity Risk Management Strategy, Governance, and Incident Disclosure Rule. This rule dramatically changes the game.
How so?
It requires public companies to transparently and effectively manage their cybersecurity risk, treating it not just as an IT headache, but as a material financial risk. Most critically, it mandates that companies disclose any material cybersecurity incident within 4 business days of determining its materiality.
4 days. That's fast.
And it requires regular updates on their governance structure for handling cyber risk.
And finally, the 2024 Climate Disclosure Rule, which pushes the SEC deep into environmental, social, and governance ESG reporting territory.
This is one of the most contentious rules in modern SEC history. The enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures for investors. It moves climate risk from voluntary corporate messaging to mandatory statutory disclosure.
So companies have to report it.
They do. It requires companies to disclose information regarding 2 main risk areas. First, their risk of being financially impacted by climate change itself, physical risks like extreme weather-damaging assets, or transition risks related to new technologies.
And the second area.
Second, and crucially, they must disclose risks related to growing climate change regulations, particularly concerning their direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions produced. It forces companies to quantify climate risk as a quantifiable financial factor relevant to investor decisions.
To bring this deep dive to a close, let's look at the external mechanisms the SEC uses to ensure compliance and leverage external expertise, starting with the whistleblower program.
The whistleblower program, created by the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010 and 2011, is arguably the most successful tool the SEC has acquired in recent history. It acknowledges that the people with the best information about internal fraud are often employees.
And it gives them a powerful financial incentive to overcome the fear of reporting.
A very powerful incentive. The reward is substantial, designed to heavily incentivize the reporting of complex internal fraud.
How does it work?
Eligible individuals who provide original, useful information about securities law violations can receive a monetary award of 10 to 30% of the monetary sanctions collected by the SEC and other agencies, provided the sanctions total over $1 million.
And has it been effective?
The recovery metrics demonstrate its effectiveness. As of 2021, the program had recovered a staggering $4.8 billion in monetary remedies as a direct result of whistleblower information.
$4.8 billion.
And it paid out over $1 billion to the whistleblowers themselves. This really shows the necessity of using internal knowledge to expose sophisticated frauds that regulators might otherwise miss.
And since the complexity and sheer volume of the U.S. financial markets are too vast for one agency to handle alone, the SEC has to rely heavily on interagency cooperation.
Absolutely. The SEC works extensively with the self-regulatory organizations we mentioned, like FINRA and state securities regulators, particularly concerning localized fraud. Federally, they coordinate with law enforcement and critical sister agencies like the Federal Reserve,
Which handles monetary policy.
and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, or CFTC, which handles derivatives and commodity trading.
And this collaboration at the highest level of U.S. financial governance is formalized through an executive order.
Yes. In 1988, Executive Order 12631 established the President's Working Group on Financial Markets. This group is chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury and includes the Chairman of the SEC, the Federal Reserve, and the CFTC. Their goal is explicit: to constantly enhance the integrity, efficiency, orderliness, and competitiveness of the U.S. financial markets, especially during moments of crisis.
Finally, let's circle back to the state versus federal regulatory balance, which began with those blue sky laws. Where does that balance stand today?
State securities regulators still retain anti-fraud authority under those original blue sky laws. However, a major piece of legislation, the National Securities Markets Improvement Act of 1996, or NSMIA, addressed the problem of overlapping bureaucracy.
What was the problem?
Before NSMIA, a large company selling stock nationally might have had to register its securities in all 50 states, which created massive cost and inefficiency.
So the NSMIA stepped in to remove that burden.
Exactly. NSMIA largely preempted state registration requirements for nationally traded securities, preventing that inefficient 50-state registration process. But, and this is the crucial distinction, it explicitly preserved the state's anti-fraud authority over all securities traded in the state.
So states can still go after fraud.
Right. So while federal law governs the national registration and primary disclosure, state regulators still have a vital role in policing fraud locally and protecting citizens from bad actors, often working alongside the SEC's regional offices.
So what does this all mean? We've looked at an agency whose mandate spans 9 decades, from restoring faith in physical stock certificates after the Great Depression to today, where they're using complex algorithms from DA to police the market and deciding the regulatory status of tokenized real-world assets.
It's an immense scope.
The scope of the SEC is immense, and its role as the market watchdog is non-negotiable for maintaining confidence in the U.S. economy.
The complexity we've uncovered really highlights the critical tension at the very heart of the agency. On one hand, the SEC is crucial for investor protection, and we see evidence of success with tools like the whistleblower program recovering billions of dollars.
And the new rules forcing transparency on cyber and climate risk.
Right. But on the other hand, you have the documented operational and ethical failures, the systemic ignoring of Madoff, the destruction of investigative documents, and the conflicts of interest involving both SEC staff like Swanson and the ultimate internal watchdog, Caput.
Those internal dynamics just severely undermine the agency's credibility during the most sensitive periods.
Absolutely. It's an agency designed for political independence, but one that has repeatedly struggled with internal integrity and accountability.
And that is the paradox. The structure of the SEC was deliberately set up from its inception to ensure independence by stipulating that the president cannot fire the appointed commissioners. This is meant to insulate them from political pressure.
But the question you have to ask yourself, the investor and citizen, is this. Considering the documented failures where investigations were compromised by personal relationships, where tips were ignored, and where the agency's own inspector general failed to hold the powerful within the organization accountable for critical probes, how effective is that external independence if the system designed to watch the watchers fails so spectacularly?
What checks should you, the investor and citizen, demand from the ultimate market watchdog when the system designed to prevent political interference still allows internal ethical conflicts to erode public trust? That's something worth mulling over long after this deep dive is done.